Let me first confess that I was not involved in Acres, and that therefore my
born in Acres.
I'm afraid I was, but my comments are very much based on the modest role I played as EU Non-Proliferation Consortium chairman in building up, convening, or co-organizing and chairing the two EU seminars, which gave me a sort of a fantastic opportunity to jump into the Middle East great path and see, of course, all the complexities of this process. And even though I do think these events were very useful, they were, in general, they were also very useful to me to get a better sense of where everyone is standing, and that's what I'm going to try to share with you today. Of course, you're all familiar with the background of the Middle East WMD-Free zone debate, so I will be very extraordinarily brief on that, especially since a lot of it has been already said by Emily and the two speakers. I think it's worthwhile to sort of acknowledge that the issue has been on the table for more than 30 years as a starter. So it's not a plot at the 2010 NPT conference. It's not an attempt by... it has been around. So we can't completely... it's been disconnected from conflicts in many cases. It sort of pre-existed even the first peace treaty signed by Israel. So it's one of these issues that is there, whether we like it or not. It has been on the table with a very large support. And if you look at the vote in the first committee, even with a sort of unanimous support in a way, at least for the principle of such a zone. The second thing is that the 95 resolution made it, at least for some countries, a central element of the NPT bargain. And this is something that as NPT, for those of us that are NPT signatories, is creating, if not an obligation, at least some sort of pressure to address the issue. Of course, the fact that the 2010 NPT review conference sort of relaunched the process by scheduling a dedicated conference in 2012 to be convened by the depositories made it all the more central in this NPT process. Of course, the decision was once again part of a broader package for achieving consensus at the review conference. And after a lengthy debate, the difficult task of serving as facilitator was given to Finland, with the Ambassador Jaakko Lajava skillfully playing that role. Lastly, as you did all notice, the 2012 conference did not take place. So what can we do about it except stop calling it the 2012 conference, Shimon? Maybe it's a plot on your part. The more we call it the 2012 conference, the more bizarre it will sound in 15 years from now if we keep calling it the 2012 conference. So
here it's not bizarre. Here we had a program of building a new airport which was called Ben Gurion 2000. It ended in 2010 or something.
Okay. Honestly, the same applies to many things, and I think the French army, for instance, just if you allow me that, is still running after its Army 1997 model today. So anyway. So what are let me look at the possible incentives for holding the conference for each category of stakeholders before sharing with you some thoughts on the achievability, feasibility of the process. So if we look at creating the conditions for a useful conference, I think we need to look at the different players. Some of us would look at them as in a sort of blaming game, so who will be blamed for the failure of the conference? Some of us will look at it in a way of what are the incentives to convince each category of players to join the process. So I'll try to mix these two. First of all, there is the issue of the conveners, which is important in the NPT framework, because basically they are the ones, so the US, the UK, and Russia, that are being held accountable for the conference taking place or not taking place. And they are the ones who are going to be under pressure for that. So their interest is a fairly sort of bureaucratic interest of meeting their promise to not be under too much fire in the prepcoms, refcons in the future. And in a way that's their problem, but it's a problem that could have a broader impact on the NPT, and this is probably the reason why they all keep, each in their different way, an effort to meet, to at least all the conference, no longer in 2012, but all the conference. So that's I think a first category. The facilitator is in a different position. It would be hard to blame him, as Ambassador Layev has spared very little effort to put this together, and does honestly get a fairly large and unanimous reconnaissance for his role in this. So I don't think, and I think he's been right in his management of the cancellation of the event, even though dates had been circulated, to not put himself forward on this, and to sort of recognize that he did his best, and that at a certain point it was a decision by the depositories to convene or not convene the conference. As far as the Arabs are concerned, I think we face a complicated situation. When they should be or have been the most convinced supporters of the project, Egypt has been promoting this free zone for decades. We are in a rather bizarre situation where the real issue is becoming, do the Arabs, starting with Egypt, prefer a good compromise to hold the conference, or tend to go for a tougher position at the expenses of a successful process for a variety of reasons. Some of them might be domestic and foreign policy that are simply focused on other issues, internal challenges, aftermath of the Arab Spring, Syria, which means that the sort of perception that it was a central foreign policy issue for at least several Arab states is no longer relevant. For that, I'm quite interested in, the Egyptian case. Has it become a purely bureaucratic issue in Egypt? On the Saudi case, the Saudis were very much at the forefront of that debate with a very interesting position for a long time. And since the Syrian issue has been up, it seems that the Saudi diplomacy has very much vanished from that debate in a way. Maybe because it's very focused on Syria, and it doesn't want to be engaged into the sort of necessary traction within the Arab League on that particular issue for that. So and the second thing is, with the current and new regimes in the Arab world, there remains this inability to engage Israel on a security issue seriously. And that is making things far more complicated than what it should be. The next stakeholder is obviously Iran. Iran is interesting because it's the one country that is not part of the Arab League position, so it doesn't, of course, it's together with Israel, the only country that is not an Arab League country, and therefore it can design its position very much on its own. Interestingly, the Iranians, and to a certain extent to my surprise, because I could have expected them to be more spoilers in that process, as they've deliberately taken the path of being rather supportive. Ambassador Soltanieh sat in the Brussels meeting announcing that Iran would take place in a conference that was not convened, which was both, I believe, a smart tactical move to not be blamed for anything, but also an interesting move on their part, and which connects with the fact that Iran has been very much also the other supporter of that zone with Egypt from the outstart. Nevertheless, probably the Iranians do see the WMD-Free zone debate as a great opportunity to lift some pressure on the debate on their own program by sort of regionalizing the debate, and it's for them a rather good opportunity to have this balance that many of us refuse between the Israeli capabilities and the Iranian capabilities. Israel, in my view, has chosen a rather sound approach by insisting on security dimension and reassurances on procedural issues. It is quite clear that when dealing with such a security challenge, I would completely concur with Shlomo's point on the fact that consensus is indeed very central. You can't reasonably expect any country to engage into such a process without having clarified the rules of procedure and based on the assumption that consensus is the rule. We're not talking about a process in which you can actually opt in or out. If you look at, for instance, to take another arms control process, let's say, cluster munition debate that didn't work on. It's one of the rare, together with the Ottawa process, that one of the rare opportunities where the negotiation was not under consensus. This was acceptable, I think, in a humanitarian framework, and it was acceptable for all parties, including those who would not sign and those who would sign, knowing that others would not sign. This is not applicable, I believe, in the case of the WMD-Free zone. For Israel, I believe, and maybe this is where I also join Shlomo on the missed opportunity part of the debate, I think it's a great opportunity to expose to the other players in the region Israeli concerns, Israeli views, as there are very, very few opportunities to do so directly. And I was always very interested when setting up these EU events on the fact that many of the people around the table have in fact very few opportunities to meet and engage directly. So I think it was the value of the EU process, and it would be the value of holding such a conference, and precisely because there are so few opportunities. I mean, if there were plenty of venues to meet and gather and chat and discuss, maybe the process would have less of a political value and a security value. In the current circumstances, I see a lot of value in even having a chance to do that. To be very blunt and honest about the Israeli case, to wrap up on this, I would say that there are in the international community very serious doubts that have nothing to do with the MFA skill in the and very active participation in all the track 2, track 1.5 events that have taken place, on whether at the political level there is a willingness to engage into the process. Of course, the Prime Minister is on the record for having been extremely critical of the 2010 decision. So there is this big question mark of whether, even if Israel got everything it wanted for the process, and all its requirements for the process, would it be politically acceptable for the cabinet to engage in this? Israel probably being one of the few countries where this is a highly political decision. That is, I think, important. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, you see a very large support within the NAM, and you have this interesting commitment by the EU that I need not only in my capacity as a EU consortium, but in general, I like, because I think it's an interesting case, a test case for the EU CFSP, as the EU sort of took a position, including in the NPT final document, of saying it would support this and making the effort of doing it, which was worth noting. So let me turn to the desirability and achievability of this. First of all, I would again highlight the value of the process in a region where WMD and missiles are a reality. This is, some say it's easy to do a nuclear weapon-free zone or a WMD-free zone in regions where they don't exist, and it's more complicated in regions where they exist, indeed. But having said that, it might be one more reason to look seriously at the issue. Not only because they exist, but because they've been used. Missiles are a reality on a daily basis in the region. They are being used in Syria today, within Syria. They have been used in the Iran-Iraq cases. They have been used by Iraq on Israel. And they've been used by non-state actors. So we are talking about something that is a reality, and I think this is one reason to look at it seriously. And I would say it's a good reason to hold talks on these issues again, and holding the conference itself that I will continue not to call the 2012 conference, but you know which conference I'm talking about. In my conclusion to the first EU seminar, I insisted on a point that I think is important and that echoes a lot of broader disarmament and arms control talks, which is the notion of increased security for all. I think if there was one objective that could be rallied by everyone, it would definitely be a good one, as it does, in a way, connect the WMD-free zone debate to the broader debate about peace and security in the Middle East, but it also puts the emphasis on the fact that the entire matter is to increase security through a variety of measures that would come to in a second. I think very strongly disagree with Shimon on the Asian model. I'm not convinced. Beside the fact that it's very light, I'm not sure it's a good sell. Because the Asian model, when we look at it, it's a model of arms race, it's a model of uncertainties and so on at the moment, with a huge build-up in the region, both in conventional and eventually non-conventional capabilities. So I'm not entirely buying the fact that the European model should be discarded as too complicated to implement, and the Asian model should be sort of put on some sort of a pedestal for the beauty of the ARF, ability to tackle some of the security challenge in Asia. I don't see that honestly at the moment, and I would be very skeptical on taking Asia as a model for such a process. When I think you were a bit tough on the European model, which is not that bureaucratic, not that complicated, it is a model of consensus, and it is a model which has evolved into something quite interesting, starting from a situation in which we were in very complicated political relations, and evolved into something more substantial. So I would tend to make the case, and there is there's 20 years between almost 20 years between the first steps of the Helsinki process in Europe and the first treaties addressing either nuclear weapons or conventional weapons, and as such, I think it's worthwhile noting. On the feasibility, I think I would very much insist also on the sort of on an incremental approach. I think we know that the conference, and we should be aware of the fact that the conference will not deliver, certainly not the first conference, and maybe not even the process itself, will not deliver a draft treaty for signature by the countries in the region. And this is quite clear. And I don't think, even in the wildest dreams of the conveners, of the facilitators, of the EU, this is what anyone is seriously thinking about. The process and the conference should be seen as an opportunity for a dialogue on improving security. And for that, of course, the terms of reference are essential. And again, here, I very much agree with what has been said by both Shimon and Shlomo. Because indeed, if the entire focus on the conference is how to convince Israel to sign the NPT, and that solves the problem, it is not meeting all parties' requirements. I think it is an opportunity to look at potential steps, and many of them, some of them might be bilateral or unilateral. Some of them might be multilateral, but not involving the entire region. Some of them might be regional. Some of them might be involving outside players as part of that. And I think and the fact that the facilitator view the participation of the P5 as important, I think is a very important point for that, because building up security in the region is certainly the prime responsibility of regional players, but others could play a role there. A focus has been put on CSBMs. Indeed, there is I would say, a strange, especially in Egypt, criticism of CSBMs as a plot to avoid other things. I think there is a good case to be made that CSBMs are a necessary step towards something more ambitious, and that therefore discarding them as a starting point, and even being opposed to the fact that the wording of CSBMs would appear on an agenda is not, I think, a sound approach to that. Of course, there is a fear, and which mirrors the Israeli interest for going back to acres, as if acres was the sort of counter model or the model. I think, indeed, we're talking about something different than acres, but I don't see why we shouldn't take the lessons of acres, the successes and failures of acres on board of this discussion. But among the CBMs that are indeed very essential, I mean, pre-notification of exercise and missile tests are obvious examples that I share with Shlomo of things that could easily be done, and that would allow to enter a different approach. Then there is, I think it would be also an opportunity, it should be an opportunity to take a fresh look at existing treaties and agreements and see where everyone in the region is. Of course, if you start with the most complicated cases of saying of NPT, of the relationship of Israel with the NPT, you're not exactly helping the process. But if you look at the wide range of treaties and arrangements and other mechanisms, whether they are code of conducts, like the Hague Code of Conduct on missiles, whether they are implementation of the 1540, for instance, you see a wide variety of things that could be done, short of ratifying the last treaty of concern for each country. And I think there can be indeed a lot of steps taken, including by Israel, that would build up the atmospherics for that. And they could be taken as in a coordinated unilateral steps, as bilateral steps. And if you look, whether you look at the BTWC, whether you look at the HCOC, I see plenty, or the CTBT, I see plenty of steps that could be extremely useful without jeopardizing the security of any of the stakeholders. I finally note as an important point that, of course, the connection with the NPT is a very tricky thing for Israel. I recognize that. Nevertheless, this is where the whole story started for many of the, especially for the conference itself. So it's a complicated thing, but I think there can be a reasonable approach to that. And we've all been saying in the last 2 days that we value the non-proliferation regime, and the NPT is only one part of it. I think it's a wise way of looking at it. So as a conclusion, I continue to believe that it's important to hold the conference as a first critical step, and not only to meet our NPT requirements. I think it's the fact that the conference would not take place would be a very poor signal altogether. And in a way, I would be somehow more relaxed about the NPT. I mean, the NPT conference have failed over a variety of issues in the past. Maybe the 2015 conference will fail over the Middle East. It can fail over plenty of other issues. We have a broader, as we've been discussing in the last couple of days, we have a broader problem with the NPT on how to uphold the norm in the future than the Middle East alone and the Middle East process alone. Having said this, of course, this is part of the situation, but it's only one small bit. I would say that it is interesting to hold the conference on its own merits and for all stakeholders. To address directly the title of my presentation, including the question mark, I would say that I remain a long-term optimist as much as a rather short-term pessimist for all the reasons I've mentioned. And I continue to argue in favor of an incremental process that would bring the countries of the region closer and, in a step-by-step approach, address the various problems by looking at each weapon category, at CBMs, at the issue of verification, which is obviously a critical one in any step, and compliance, of course, because there are some obvious lessons to be taken of the fact that countries in the region have not complied with some of their commitments. So I'm not sure this is a distant dream. I nevertheless tend to believe that we would need some sort of game changer to make it real. Those game changers could come from a major event, whether it's positive or negative. In the negative category, I would put another conflict in the region, another major conflict in the region, which could in return prompt to this. And for instance, I don't rule out that in the aftermath of an armed conflict with Iran, there would be an incredible push to put this back on the agenda. Someone, I don't know how I should count that whistle as an approval or a disapproval, but anyway.
The game is over.
I would also think of more positive events as a resumption of peace talks and things like that could make it possible. Altogether, I think the most critical issue in many ways is that we need a significant change of mindset in the region. Not so much that I would not go as far as saying that peace is a precondition, of course, because that's making things a bit too complicated of having peace for the region as a starting point, but to admit that peace is a distinct possibility for the region as a starting point, and that would be my other possible game changer to make the distant dream not so distant. But I do believe that it is a process with that we shouldn't look necessarily as a chicken and egg debate on this, but as something that can actually help both ways. And the more peace is a distinct possibility, the more chances there are that this process will advance, but this process can also advance the cause for peace and stability in the region. So I'll stop there on this, let's say, more optimistic note on the usefulness and the feasibility of working towards a WMD-free zone in the region.
Thank you.